Have you ever wanted to go on an epic bike ride? Well, how about trying an almost 2,000-mile journey from Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri on a one-speed bicycle in the middle of the summer? That's what the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps did almost 125 years ago. In honor of Black History Month, Q2's Krista Rose pedals back in time to tell us more about the Buffalo Soldiers of the 25th and their two-wheeled cross-country mission.
In the 1800s, African American soldiers were not uncommon in the U.S. military. Segregated units began serving during the Civil War, and it's not certain as to why these units and men became known as Buffalo Soldiers. Theories on the moniker abound. But what is certain, however, is that the name stuck, and by the end of the 19th century, Buffalo Soldier units were populating forts throughout the West. Such was the case of the 25th Infantry, who made their home for years at Fort Missoula here in Montana. I spoke with Matt Lotzenheiser, the executive director of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, and he explained more.
So they were here for about a decade. It was the 25th Infantry, several companies, initially about 4 companies of the 25th Infantry were stationed at Fort Missoula, and they arrived in 1888, and they were here through 1898, and that was when the Spanish-American War broke out in Cuba, and they were pulled out of Fort Missoula to be sent to Cuba to fight during that Spanish-American War.
Before they would go to Cuba in 1898 and help future President Teddy Roosevelt take San Juan Hill, the 25th was given the mission of testing bicycles for the Army as a potential replacement for the cavalry.
There was thought that bicycles would cost about a quarter to maintain as it would to maintain a horse. So as early as 1894, one of the generals, General Nelson Miles, had this idea of creating a bicycle corps. Where our connection came in, there was a second lieutenant named James Moss, and Moss had developed this idea, and he reached out to Miles and asked permission to form a bicycle corps at Fort Missoula.
Moss was given the go-ahead to start working with bikes, and after a successful 16-day, nearly 800-mile round trip to Yellowstone National Park in 1896, the Corps geared up for their real test, a one-way, 1,900-mile bicycle ride from Missoula to St. Louis. On June 14, 1897, Lieutenant Moss, 20 soldiers, and a local newspaper reporter who would document the entire journey set off on this epic mission. 50-pound, one-speed bikes, each carrying men and supplies, traveled roughly 50 miles a day through every kind of terrain imaginable.
One of the reasons they chose St. Louis is that it allowed them, from an experimental point of view, to travel through several different climates and also multiple types of soil, like the sandy soils of Wyoming and the more muddy or rockier terrain in Montana, and then kind of the mud that they dealt with once they get down in Nebraska and Missouri. The trip itself was kind of a nightmare. The guys dealt with a ton of rain and inclement weather, and they referred to the mud as gumbo because it kept sticking to the wheels. And of course, at the time, there were no good roads.
Even a trip like that today would be daunting, but you could at least navigate on paved roads if you really wanted to. Back then, probably not.
No. In fact, the roads were so bad at some points that they were actually forced to ride on the railroad tracks. And you can imagine how unpleasant and how jarring that would be to spend 8 hours a day riding on railroad tracks.
It was a tough, grueling, muscle-aching mission. But the fortitude of the Corps was immeasurable, and for 41 days that summer, they inspired the nation. Americans across the country read of the journey in newspapers from coast to coast. When they reached St. Louis, hundreds of cyclists rode out to meet them and escort them into town where thousands were cheering. The St. Louis Star reported that the 25th Infantry's journey was the most marvelous cycling trip in the history of the wheel. Sadly, but maybe for the best, the bicycle never did take over for the horse. Too many repairs were needed, and the movement never seemed to gain enough traction either before or after the Spanish-American War. But the legacy of the 25th and their incredible ride lives on.
One of the legacies they have here is that, that they broke barriers. I mean, they changed many people's opinions of African Americans, and their views of Buffalo Soldiers in general and African Americans in the military. It's an incredible legacy, and I think it's something too that the African American community can continue to take pride in with this service that they provided with these Buffalo Soldier units.
Reporting in Billings, Chris DeRose, MTN News.